Hello and welcome to Politics and Pastimes, where politics is our pastime. We are passionate about political discourse, and we don't let our differences interfere with our friendship. I'm Justin, coming at you from the center right. As an engineer, I really like process, and I'm data-driven, so I'll do my best to filter out all the bullshit.
And I'm Jonathan. I am a professor of political science and composition. Come from a little bit more to the left on domestic politics, not so much in international relations. Being a professor, I like to at least think I'm good at being devil's advocate, and probably going to work on that quite a bit today because my semester's starting up on Monday, so I got to get back into my game.
So today, we're going to be discussing two things: voting strategies and media consumption. So why those topics? Well, Congress is in recess. It's a week before the Democratic convention, and the Supreme Court's in recess. So why not discuss these interesting things?
And they're also pretty relevant to the election. So I think that gives people a little bit more depth into what we've been talking about. In terms of preparing for the day, I found a really good beer for election strategies. I've got Avery's Island Rascal today. It's a Belgian wit with a touch of passion fruit. I don't like a lot of fruit in beer, but I like this one because it's tart. And I've known the Averys personally since we moved to Boulder back in the 90s. Loved Avery beer. Started going to Avery when the tap room was actually free, but they've since sold out. So now I'm torn because I tend not to want to support breweries that have sold out because now I'm supporting Kirin if I buy their stuff. But I love this beer, and there's not really an easy replacement. So I suck it up and buy the beer that's now owned by the major Japanese brewer.
Well, very little thought went into my choice. I'm going with Sayuri sake. I really enjoyed my sushi meal last week. And you know what? I figured let's have some sake too. Some bit of housekeeping. We will no longer be doing the segment at the end strictly on food and beverage. We're just going to incorporate it in our intro and just jump straight into the politics.
There you go.
All right. So for our first segment of the day, I want to talk about voting strategies. Obviously, if you are a partisan Republican or a partisan Democrat, this probably isn't going to apply too much to you in terms of the general election, at least. But I think that there are two really interesting groups to talk about right now. The first are the Never Trumpers and how they're going to vote in this upcoming election. And the second are the people, I don't want to call them single issue voters, but the people who are very pro Gaza. They really don't like how the war is going down there. They really want the current administration to put a lot of pressure on Israel to stop the war. And during the Democratic primary, this group got a lot of attention by refusing to vote for Joe Biden. And obviously, Kamala Harris is going to try and recruit them, and we'll see how successful they are in that regard. So, let's talk about the Never Trumpers first. The way I see it is that there's two types of Never Trumpers. There are the ones who are going to vote for Kamala Harris, right? And then there are going to be the ones who vote, they might write in Mitt Romney, they might vote third party, but they absolutely will not vote for the Democrat.
You think that that's a real Never Trumper? Or you think that's somebody just trying to demonstrate how meritorious they are?
I think, to be honest, unless you're in a swing state, you don't really have to put your principles to the test, right? There are only going to be, let's say, 10 states where you're actually going to have to really make that decision. But if you are in a state like Kentucky, you can be a Never Trumper and vote for whoever you want. It's not going to fundamentally change the outcome.
That's what I'm saying. It's kind of like a virtue, a demonstration of virtue signaling to say, I'm a Never Trumper, but I won't vote for a Democrat. So you're kind of not really a Never Trumper, but sure, unless you're in a swing state, it doesn't really matter.
Now, I do think it's interesting, someone who's in a position of power, right? Mm-hmm. Whether you're an elected representative, or like a mayor, or someone like a secretary of state, or if you're a figure in the media, right? So David French, who's a columnist for the New York Times, he is known to be a very strong evangelical Christian, pretty smart dudes, argued in front of the Supreme Court. He has a podcast called Advisory Opinions. Highly recommend listening to it. But he came out, was it 2 days ago or yesterday, and said he's voting for Kamala Harris. So I do think that even though he lives in a non-swing state, I think it's Tennessee, I do think him putting his credibility on the line is something to be considered as well.
Sure. Although if you think about it, like compare him to, say, Nikki Haley, right? Donald Trump this, Donald Trump that. But you know what? We should vote for Donald Trump after all, because she wants to have a future in the party, and she thinks she thinks that route goes through the Trumpists and the MAGA movement, which she's probably not wrong. David French writes for the New York Times. He's not going to be fired for being another Trumper. So yeah, while I agree with you, and I that's very cynical of me to say it in that way about David French, I think it's probably fairly accurate about Nikki Haley and her never Trumper status. It's like,
I wouldn't describe Nikki Haley as a never Trumper at all. She endorsed him at the convention.
First, she didn't. First, she said he was horrible. He shouldn't be president. This, that, and the other. Sure. Until she changed her mind.
How is that fundamentally different than someone running in the primary, right? We had
but I mean the way
Martin O'Malley in 2016 say both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are too old.
Right,
you shouldn't vote for them.
That's a little bit different than saying Donald Trump is morally. She was pretty personal in her attacks.
Yeah, and I mean,
all of a sudden she says basically all these attacks weren't valid. Okay.
I don't know.
In any case,
I've seen enough primaries where that doesn't bother me as much.
Oh, it doesn't bother me at all.
You kind of expect the endorsement at the end.
Yep.
Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama in 2008, they said some pretty nasty things.
Sure.
But you know what?
In any case,
Hillary served in his administration. So
I think I've steered us away from where we were going. And
sure.
So if we get back to how they're going to vote, right? What I think is interesting isn't so much the options, it's what the different parties can do about it, right? So if you're Donald Trump, is there anything you can do to get these never Trumpers back?
At this point, no.
I'm thinking no, unless they have aspirations that you can help them meet.
I think so. There are a handful of there are two types of never Trumpers, I think. The ones who are fundamental, like they view Trump as having crossed a red line, right? Mm-hmm. On January 6th. I don't think he can get those kind of folks.
Probably not.
I do think that there is some slice. I don't know how large a slice is, but the ones who really care about national security issues, they really don't like his anti-Ukraine stance. I could see them, if Trump came out and said, hey, I'm going to continue an aggressive policy against Russia and keep funding Ukraine, then I think a certain slice of the Republican Party would say, you know what, fine, I can handle voting for him again.
I think sort of that.
How large that is, I don't know.
I think that argument, though, is kind of a piece with a lot of arguments about how Trump could expand his base by not being himself. And I don't think he's capable of that at this point in time. I think he's sort of made his bed with those principled never Trumpers. I think he does have some leeway with people that have sort of,
like Nikki Haley is a good example of this, right? She's not a never Trumper, but I think she believes that Trump can be controlled and go back to that Reagan conservative set of policies.
I would argue that I don't think she really probably really doesn't, but I think she thinks she needs his approval more or less to continue advancing in the Republican Party. I would think
that wouldn't surprise me with her. She's pretty cynical when it comes to politics. Yeah.
Because I mean, she's a smart woman. She knows he's who he is. She knows he's not going to change who he is. Right? If he's not going to change who he is after the assassination attempt, he's not going to change who he is. And he's shown us in the last few weeks he really isn't interested in changing who he is.
No, definitely not. Now, what about someone like Liz Cheney, who is I would definitely describe her as the never Trumper. Chris Christie, never Trumper.
I was going to
Mitt
mention
Romney, never Trumper.
My wife, I was actually talking about this with my wife, and she's like, where is Liz Cheney? How come we haven't seen any? We haven't ever.
She created a some sort of PAC, political action committee.
Right, but I haven't. Have you seen her in the news? And
no, definitely not.
She's really dropped off the scene. So if she is a never Trumper, she's sort of a passive never Trumper, right? She's not really
that, or she's still trying to figure out what to do, right?
Could be.
So there's a reporter named Matt Lewis at the Daily Beast. Mm-hmm. He really believes that if he votes for someone like Harris, right, that his credibility as a conservative and his voice will just go away. Sure. Because
also, a lot of people sort of implying about David French, right? He doesn't have that risk.
I mean, he's trying to spin it like that, right? He says, "Hey, I am a conservative first."
Sure.
And this is how Trump is not conservative.
Right.
The Republican Party is becoming less pro-life.
But right? Again, he was writing this from the pages of the New York Times.
Yeah, but I mean,
so it's a little different. To me, it's a little bit different. He knows, in some sense, he knows where his bread is buttered, to use the cliche. Whereas if you're a never Trumper that's not with the Times, it's a little bit more. And again, I'm beating this issue too much, but I am wondering what we're going to see from somebody like Liz Cheney, right? She torpedoed her career intentionally to go after Trump.
She doesn't have much else to lose, to be honest.
Why would you? I don't know. To me, if I've gone this far and completely blown my career up, I might as well try to take you down with me.
Yeah, someone like Christie and Romney and Cheney, their political careers are finished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, if I were in their shoes, right, I would endorse Harris, or at the very least, I would try and come up with some sort of like write-in, like pool your resources together, right? And say, hey, you know what, who's a good conservative we can just put on the ballot, and if they get like 4% of the vote, and it tips the election, they could at least live with themselves at night, maybe. But they're still going to be blamed, right? I mean, we still blame Ralph Nader for the 2000 election. So that's actually like a pretty good segue into discussing RFK Jr.
Well, one thing I wanted to talk about a little bit first, though, before we jump into him, you mentioned the single issue voters, and I think that there's a lot of those to consider. Like, what should they do, right? And RFK Jr. is a good sample for that as well.
Yeah,
we're talking about
sure.
So the pro Gaza anti-Israel war voters, right?
Yeah.
What are they really? Are they really going to vote for Trump? Not so much. They might stay home, right? It seems like when I've been reading that they're more likely to come out and vote for Harris, right? Because they feel that she's less harmful than staying home and sending a message. But that's sort of your option, right? If you're diametrically opposed to the other guy, but you're mad at your person, you can either stay home and help the other guy win, or get over it and vote for your guy, or woman in this case.
Yeah, I think it really depends on your tolerance for risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of these pro-Gaza folks, there's a lack of imagination, right, of how bad things can get. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's really bad there right now. If you're just like a Gazan citizen, your life is in danger every single day. It's frightening. But it could also be a lot worse under the Trump administration, right? So it between that lack of imagination, when you have the lack of imagination of what the possible outcomes are, that can really bias your decision-making process, right?
Sure.
Like if Trump said, hey, we are going to end the war by creating concentration camps, and then we're going to ethnically cleanse the area and move them to the West Bank. And that was like a defined policy. Then I think they'd be singing a different tune, right? Because you now know of like, oh, this is a possible outcome. Geez, Louise, I really want to prevent that outcome. So we have to consider that as well when it comes to these voting strategies, because if you don't see all the options on the table, then a lot of these tail risk scenarios. So basically, like the less than 10% chance of happening,
Mm.
kind of get swept under the rug, right?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that we need to go that far to make an argument about why you shouldn't necessarily do this, right? Because even that's, as you say, that's not very likely to happen. But he's not going to change the policy in any way to make it better for the Palestinians. Right?
Sure,
that's your
but
there's no
they
chance.
might.
There's a chance,
right, but they might see it as the same, right? So
yeah.
why not stay at home, right? If you think that outcomes are equal, then staying at home has no risk, right?
Mm-hmm. If you're only thinking about that one issue. And so I think if you're going to campaign to these people,
mm-hmm.
I would take more of a tack of sort of the enemy, right, of the good is the perfect. That old phrase, and I'm sure I butchered that in some ways. But
I think it's the opposite. The
enemy of the perfect. No.
The enemy of the good is perfection.
Like that. But in any case,
perfection is the enemy of good.
This person doesn't have every single thing I want them to have. And the one thing I really want them to have is the most important thing to me, so I'm going to vote against them. Right. Whereas if you think all the places where most of these people, fairly progressive, they line up with Harris pretty well across the board, except for this one issue. So I would take that approach if I'm trying to
nationwide. I would agree with you, but I do think that in Michigan, where it's a swing state,
mm-hmm.
there are a lot of Arab voters who have lost relatives in the region, and they are kind of conservative, right?
Well, then she's lost them anyway.
Maybe if she could guarantee that she would push
but she's not
Israel into a ceasefire. No, she won't do that. But she could, right?
Okay.
If she was in a scenario, right, where this is going to dictate the outcome of Michigan, and she saw that, hey, you know what? If I come up with this policy, it's not going to hurt me in the other states. Why wouldn't she do it, right?
Okay. Well, one, I think it would, but two,
probably.
She's not going to. I think the way to go to get some of these people back is not to say we're going to bend over backwards and do everything you want in Gaza. There's just the same way we're going to bend over backwards and do everything the Israelis want. She's just not going to do that. I think the only way to woo those hardcore people back is to try to say, hey, you know what? Remember, we align on all these other policies, right? If you vote for the other guy or stay home and he wins, all these things go away. You might, and you're not going to get anything better on the Gaza policy either. The Gaza policy, at best for you, will stay the same, and everything else will get worse. Right? So I would really push that if I'm trying to woo back some of these single issue voters. And I would say the same thing for, here can be our segue to Kennedy. Same thing for sort of the anti-vaccine lunatics, let's call it as we see it, they're supporting Kennedy. By the way, if anybody's interested and they want to do some other reading that's not in our reading list for today, because you got to have a subscription for it, read the New Yorker's piece, actually it's from last week, profiling Kennedy. He is one strange guy that's alienated a lot of people in his life. It's got some really interesting revelations about him from friends, family, people that have known him forever. Makes him look even weirder and worse than he comes across on TV and in the news now. And that's saying something.
Yeah. And he recently admitted to dumping a bear cub in Central Park, right?
Yes. He denies bringing a wounded bird in a bucket to a meeting and asking the people to send an intern to take it to the vet. But people swear he did that too. So
he's definitely a strange guy.
But he's portrayed as a serial philanderer. He's cheated on all of his wives.
Right.
Drove one, apparently, ostensibly anyway, to suicide when he left her. It's just, he's...
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think what has helped Kennedy is ignorance, right? People don't know that stuff.
They also...
He got such a big boost because of all the double haters, right?
Well,
when it was Biden versus Trump.
The only reason he's in the conversation is his name.
Right. But I mean, when it was Biden versus Trump, you had, I don't know, let's say 20% of the electorate who said, "Oh my God, this again? I don't want to deal with it." And you see Kennedy and you don't think about it, right? You see Kennedy and you're like, well, yeah, I know that name. Mm-hmm. He's got my vote. You don't think about it.
Now the interesting question is, who does he hurt more now? And I think right now he probably hurts Trump more.
Yeah, I think that's pretty certain. I have to look at the data again, but I'm almost I mean, when it was Biden versus Trump, they were thinking it was like 50-50, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
With maybe slightly more hurting Trump. So like say 55, 45, but yeah, now it's almost certainly,
Yep. Because if
yeah,
you think about
it's
it,
just
most of the anti-vax lunatics,
right.
despite aside from we have a ridiculously oversized sample of that here in Boulder County from the Waldorf school people, those types. It used to be, it was funny before COVID. Those were the big, those types, and a number you have in California as well. The
Yeah.
really wacky progressives were against vaccines.
Yeah.
That's shifted. That is
Yeah. I think COVID really brought out this, I want to call it libertarian streak in people, but the don't tread on me attitude, right? It's like, I don't want anyone telling me what to do. It started out with the government and then it's kind of creeped into every institution of our life, right? I don't want doctors telling me what to do. I don't want this. I don't want that.
Well, that's kind of a progression we've been seeing for years, but I will agree with you that COVID sped it up, and people are finding, I don't believe these experts. You don't show me your data. I will do my own research, right? We had to hear from Aaron Rodgers again last week. I don't know if you saw that. His new spiel is that, well, he was allergic to something. His research indicated to him that he was allergic to something in the vaccine, which is certainly unimpeachable.
Yeah. I'm sure that's the case. So yeah, I wonder, is there anything else to talk about here?
Well, I think we want to talk a little bit about, so what are the sort of options for people in this way? And I know you wanted to talk about ranked choice voting a bit.
Oh, right.
So that'll kind of, we can get into that from here. And for those of you who don't know, right, ranked choice voting is a fairly innocuous way to reorder voting. Like, you vote for your first choice, vote for your second choice. If your first choice person doesn't win, those votes get thrown out, and then they go to people's second choice until they get down to one person that has 50% plus one vote, right? That's the whole deal with ranked choice voting. We want to get to somebody with a majority. So every round you total up the votes, and the person with the fewest votes gets tossed out, and their voters go down to their next preference.
Right. And you don't necessarily have to have ranked choice voting, right? You can have instant runoff voting. So here in California, we just have an open primary for non-presidential candidates, right? And we just take the top two no matter what. So in a state like California, it's interesting because if the Republican Party doesn't have a candidate that they've endorsed, so suppose you had like your classic Reagan conservative and your MAGA type, and then on the Democrats, you have your progressive type and then your more moderate Democrat type, you could conceivably have a scenario where the progressive and the moderate Democrat end up in the top two, right?
And that's not just speculative, right? You've had that.
Right. It has happened before.
Most recently in the Senate election, correct?
The Republican Party just could not come up with like a consensus candidate. And I know you've criticized that sort of system, but from my perspective, I think it's more representative, right? Because then those Republicans who were never going to have a representative period, right? In a previous system, they could either be a Republican and vote in the Republican primary, or they could register as a Democrat and try and shift the ticket right. Now they can keep whatever party preference that they want, whether it be Republican, Independent, and then vote for the candidate that they think best represents them. Because ultimately, you want to when you win, you represent everyone, right? You don't just represent that 51%. So that's one reason why I like it.
Well, as you said, I have some critiques, and just the first one is sort of like a feel critique. To me, it feels in a democracy with basically a two-party system, it feels weird to have a general election where you don't have somebody from either party. It just doesn't strike me as the best setup. But beyond that, I think there's some practical implications that are a little bit troubling to me. One, like, if there's two Democrats on the ballot, I think you're going to have a lot of disincentive for a lot of Republicans to vote. And while that might not make much difference in the headline race, say the Senate race is the headline race on a 2-year election. right?
Yeah.
If people stay home, that can have a real impact on down ballot.
Oh, it could. Yeah.
So I think it can really discourage and skew some down ballot results, where it probably doesn't have a whole lot of impact on the main event, right? If you think about it, Democrat was going to win anyway, right?
Right. So that's important in like certain congressional districts that could go either way, right? If the top of the ticket is just all Democrat for the Senate, then you might give a boost to the Democrats, if you stay at home. But then I think it cuts both ways, right? Because, it's the campaign's job to convince you to vote, right? If you're in a, R+1 district in California, the campaign needs to convince you to come out and vote, period.
Sure.
They could say, hey, do whatever you want in the Senate, right? Vote for the more moderate one, or just don't vote at all, leave it blank. So it does cut both ways, right?
Sure.
Like your reasoning is perfectly valid. But on the other side, where it would actually affect you, which would be in these, swing districts. I think that alone is incentive enough.
Another problem I see with this is like when you're getting your top two, right? These are from primary voters. And these are from very motivated people. It's not your average. Most of your general election voters, a lot of them don't vote in the primaries. So you're having the people that are the most partisan and politically enthusiastic come out and set the table for you. Whereas in the two-party system in the general election, people are used to, well, there's a Democrat, there's a Republican, and I can pick which one I want, right? But if you come up to the general election and you don't pay attention, and it's like, hold on, why are there just two Democrats on here, right? It's your choices as a general election voter are being limited by the really politically active people who vote in primaries, which I think is, again, that's just something that it doesn't sit quite right with me.
So I'd push back on that, right? Because I think at the end of the day, you're going to get the most extreme candidate regardless, right? So suppose that we guaranteed a Republican and a Democrat at the top of the ticket, right? The people deciding who that Republican is going to be are the most partisan Republicans, and the people who are deciding the Democrat are the most partisan Democrats, right? So you're going to have two really polarized candidates there. Yeah. Whereas at least in this top two system, there's a chance. It's not a guarantee. There's a chance that you would have a more moderate person. So, obviously, like, I'm biased as someone who describes himself as center right to have representation in California, right? So I like this system. But
I do think, we discussed this as well. It's hard to say that any of your people that have been elected through this system are center right.
No, they're not. They're center left at best. But it could be worse. I don't lack.
Okay, you have the imagination.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I suppose that's fair. The other type of my other critique of ranked choice voting comes from the different style, like they have in Maine and I think in Alaska as well, as we're talking about, where you have don't have the top two. You have as many candidates as you want, and then they pick whichever. And in somewhat weird way, it kind of gives more votes to the person who votes for somebody who loses early, right? If you vote for one of the top two candidates, you're voting for one of the top two candidates every round because your choice is never thrown out, right? And that you're with them. Right? You never get to adjust your choice in the way that somebody who votes for, say, Santa Claus in Alaska can, I voted for Santa Claus in the first round. Get rid of that. Now I'm going to vote for somebody I like better in the second round. Well, and then the third round, I like this person a little bit better. You get multiple opportunities to impact the election. Whereas if you're voting for one of the main two candidates, you're one and done, which I guess in some way
you don't have to be one and done, right?
But you don't get to have other choices. Your second choice will never come up.
Well, so you made a consensus choice, right? If we're seeking consensus and you happen to choose the consensus choice first,
but it gives a benefit. It's like an extra benefit to somebody. Well, you chose poorly and your guy lost. Now you get to vote again.
Look, at the end of the day, the ranking aspect only comes into play when no one reaches a majority, right? So Maine at the presidential. So for those of you who don't know, the way Maine allocates their electoral votes is you get 2 votes for the statewide winner, and then each congressional district gets 1 vote. Mm-hmm. The 2nd district of Maine is the redder one, I believe. And so Trump won that outright through a ranked choice voting scheme. And then Biden in 2020 won it outright, won Maine 1. There you go. Congressional District 1. He got over 50% there. So it never really came into play. But suppose that, Trump only got 45% in Maine 2, right? And then Biden got 35%. That means that 55% of the congressional district did not want the plurality winner, right? Now, maybe they would be happy with it, but we don't know it until we have the ranked choice reallocation, right?
A majority better than a plurality. That's I guess what it comes down to. Why do you think 50 plus 1 vote is more impressive and more valid than if I get 49%, you get 48%, and somebody else gets 3%? Why?
I mean, that's fundamentally democracy, right?
Well, democracy isn't.
So let's look at the Electoral College, right? So you need 270 electoral votes to win, right?
Well, the Electoral College is not very democratic.
No, but let's suppose that for the sake of argument, it is, right? Mm-hmm. Now, suppose that someone got 200 electoral votes, another person got 190, and then you had the rest, right? Mm-hmm. 80 votes to some regional candidate. Okay. And that has happened in our nation's history before, right?
Our system is set up that way. So we do that intentionally, right? But in terms of these other elections, right, why do you...
But then you had that compromise, right? What was it? The corrupt bargain? Is that how Quincy Adams became president versus Andrew Jackson?
I mean... Yeah,
so that's fundamentally the same thing, right? So in any democratic system, a majority is much better than a plurality.
Okay.
And we've seen that throughout our history. Yeah.
In the Electoral College vote, right? Everybody, all 538 votes vote.
Yeah.
Where they all vote.
Yeah.
In this normal election we're doing, everybody doesn't vote. You can have your 50.1, but it's still not an actual majority of a state. It's still not an actual. It is.
That's fair, right? Because you had the couch sitters, right?
Yeah. It's sort of like, to me, sort of false accolade, or not accolades. What's the word I'm looking for? Sort of a false declaration that, hey, this is a majority now. This is more valid, but it really isn't. It's a contrived majority in the first place because they've taken people's second choice.
That part is sure. It is a contrived majority.
It's not so.
I think it does give more legitimacy to the system, right? And you might think about all those people who don't participate, right? Because they might say, "Hey, you know what? I don't like either side."
But I have a hard time.
Ranked choice voting could bring these in, right? We're just beginning to see. So Maine started doing this in 2018. Alaska did this in 2022. It would be interesting to look at voter participation trends in these states specifically, right?
So let's just have a thought experiment with me.
Yeah.
Suppose some person campaigns in Maine and wins 49% of the vote.
Right.
And 51 other candidates each get 1% of the vote.
Right.
And if you go down the rank choicing, nobody's voted for the 49% as number 2. So eventually it gets to the 51, somebody has 51, and the guy that originally had 49% loses. Is that a system that you can explain to voters that this is fair? A guy who originally had 49% of the vote lost to somebody who had 1% of the vote in the first round.
Yeah, because if everyone said, "Hey, yeah, this guy's pretty cool. He just wasn't my favorite," whereas I really hate this number, the guy who got 49%.
This person, 49% of the people in the voting booth said, "I want this guy," but no. Eventually, you go through.
Yeah, no. Don't get me wrong. That is an extreme scenario, but
it's possible.
But I still think that's preferable.
Now, we're going to agree to disagree on that. I have a hard time explaining why somebody. I mean, and a more reasonable scenario would be 49 versus, say, 35 and 10 or something like, where he still wins by 15% or so in the first round, or she, but then ends up losing once you sort of tabulate all the people that didn't like them. And it's kind of fun in that you're empowering people to make not necessarily choose between the Democrat and Republican, but by doing that, you can set up some really weird scenarios where you have to explain, especially in the era of Trump, right?
Sure.
People don't have a lot of people on one side of the spectrum, this side of the spectrum actually, don't have a lot of faith in the electoral process right now. If you were to come out and say, suppose it comes down to the electoral votes in Maine,
right?
And Trump wins 49%, Biden wins 47%, and then when you go through the ranked choice voting, actually Joe Biden wins.
Yeah.
What's going to happen?
But that's what happened in one of the main congressional districts, though, right? The Republican won the plurality.
Who cares about if that happens in the presidential election? What do you think is going to happen?
I mean, and if that happened in Maine, you know what?
If that gets us to 270.
Yeah.
By taking the election away from Trump and giving it to Biden on a second round. What do you think is going to happen?
The loser is going to be ticked off regardless. I mean, Sarah Palin made this argument in Alaska, right? She said more people voted for Republicans in the first round than for the Democrat.
Right. But again, who cares what's going on in Alaska?
Sarah Palin cared. But she might put a target on you.
They didn't storm the Capitol because of Sarah Palin losing, right?
No.
If we had unrest last time. If Trump is at 270 from after the first round in Maine, and then after the second round in Maine, they take that away from him and give it to Biden, all hell is going to break loose.
Yeah. But I mean, when you implement this system, right, this has to be part of the discussion, right?
But it hasn't been.
I disagree. Because I'd be shocked if someone didn't come up with this scenario.
Oh, sure, somebody has, but
no. Like when they were deciding, right, the question, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sure that there was some panel who would of experts in Maine who came up with this exact scenario, and then the people decided, hey, you know what? I'm going to risk it. I think this is fine. Now, maybe they're wrong, right? They might feel this way.
They also adopted this before Trump.
No, it was 2018.
Well, before they stormed the Capitol.
Yeah. All right. Alaska. Let's see. When did Alaska do it? I think right before January 6th.
Yeah, so I just think it raises legitimacy questions that people. Obviously, if you understand the system and you sign on, it's great. But I don't know that we need that extra stress in our electoral system right now. I'm not really happy about the prospect of that could happen. I think it's unlikely. I'm hoping the election isn't that close. But if that were to happen, I would be very alarmed at how the Trumpers would take that.
Right.
And how would you feel if Trump wins the election that way?
Then it is. I mean,
I would not.
Trump won the Electoral College
that way
while losing the popular vote. I mean, if you're anti-Electoral College, you have to accept it because that's the way the system is, right? And you can do everything you can to change the system and say, hey, you know what? I want to get rid of the Electoral College.
Fair enough, but
these are the rules of the game, right? When we have an election, we have to also say, hey, you know what? Regardless of what happens, regardless of the scenarios, these are the rules of the game that we've all agreed to, and we have to accept the winner of this game.
With the caveat there that most voters have not accepted the rules in Maine. Maine has put these rules on themselves, right?
But we've already accepted that each state has their own elections.
Well, I don't think if you took a poll among Republicans, they would accept that you can take the votes away from Trump if he loses in a second round and that costs him the election. I think people are not going to accept that. That's what I'm saying. That's
maybe
whether or not it's interesting in the abstract.
They're not.
I
don't know, because they're not accepting the election anyway, right? Look at all the people who refuse to certify the elections, right? The fact that we're even having this conversation, I think, points to something more sinister, right? Where regardless of the system, they just want to win, period.
That's
right. So they're going to come up with any system. They're going to.
But why make it?
They lose.
But why make it easier for them? I think this makes it easier for them to have a complaint, and this is a kind of complaint that I think would resonate with more people than just, well, we lost.
Yeah,
but
maybe we'll have to see.
Let's hope we don't.
Yeah.
But yeah, to me, I have no problem with a plurality. I think if you get a plurality, that's great. I mean, because in reality, you're getting a plurality of the voters anyway. Very few people have actually gotten, at least in modern times, I mean, maybe like in West Virginia, Trump gets a majority, an actual majority of voters, right? Possibly in California, Harris will get an actual majority of voters, but probably not when you think about all the people that stay home. So it's all a plurality in some sense. It's just trying to pretend that some pluralities are better than others.
Yeah. I guess like the alternative would be like, suppose that someone only got 35% of the vote, right? Mm-hmm. And then another candidate got, 30%. And then, I think the further your plurality is from the actual majority is when you start losing legitimacy as well. And I guess in one way, because of polarization, you don't end up like that, right? You end up like a plurality will probably always be like 47% plus. Mm-hmm. So we don't really have to think about it. So.
Yeah, it's certainly, as we've just shown, fodder for much debate, rancor, and discussion. But I think if more states start adopting this, I think we'll get more opportunities to have these really weird scenarios where people will be like, hold on a minute, is that really how we want to do things? Because it's kind of flown under the radar because it's Maine and Alaska.
Right. Yeah, and your state is going to vote on it, which I assume you're a no now.
I'm a no. My approach to the ballots are, if it's a constitutional amendment, I always vote no, because I don't think you should be able to modify the Constitution from a simple plurality of the people who choose to vote. But it's modifying, at least my reading of it, modifying state statutes, but I still don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah. And then Nevada's going to vote again on it. They are, I believe, changing their constitution in 2024. So 2026, if it passes, will be their first election.
All right. So the next thing we wanted to talk about a bit today was what's going on with the media. And I've been voiced these annoyances to Justin, and I want to talk about them a little bit more. That the media is having a hard time dealing with Trump, especially like we in my household we watched CNN when Trump was president. We watched CNN all the time because we had no idea what's going to happen and we wanted to know. I'd never have gotten all my news from CNN, but it was kind of like our nighttime thing unless there was something we wanted to watch. If there was nothing we wanted to watch, we'd throw on CNN. And it was different to me in tenor last time because most of the Trumpers they had on, or Republicans, were never Trumpers. They're obviously biased in a way that they're not going to be pro-Trump, right? They're never Trumpers. This time CNN seems to be making, and they've been doing this for a while, making a concerted effort to be more balanced, I guess. And let's not say fair and balanced because that makes a nod towards Fox News. But what that means for them is they're having a lot of Trumpers on these days. And their anchors don't seem to know how to deal with them. Because the Trumpers come on and they just basically flood the zone with lies. They say whatever they want. And they say so many things. Basically, it's a Trump tragedy. If you say so many ridiculous, outlandish things, nobody can fact check you enough, right? They're not going to get to all of them. And so you have these instances of people on the air just spewing all kinds of total propaganda on what used to be, at least for me, interesting panel discussions. And they still have some interesting panelists. And not every Republican is like this, but a lot of the Trumpers are. And the hosts just kind of get overrun. Good example. I was watching, I can't remember who it was the other night, one of the Trump campaign people, and the host tried to keep pushing back and he kept coming up with more and more lies. And eventually he got to the point, the last thing he said was, well, people think about the chaos of the Biden years and they compare it to how wonderful the Trump years were. And that's how they're going to make their decision. And the anchor didn't say anything. She was basically worn out and he let him get that in as his last word. And that didn't strike me as particularly helpful. Last night I was watching again. Nancy Mace is on, and they let her smile and lie through every topic. She's just incapable of saying anything that's not her talking point. And she does it so much, and she does it pretty well, I'll have to give her credit for that they just can't keep up with her. And they just get overrun by all this lying and mischaracterization and more or less the talking points. And that's not to say that Democrats don't have their talking points. Democrats don't have their own lies, right? but there seems to be some sort of norm is like, hey, I'm on CNN. I've been on here for years. This is how they do things on CNN. And the panels, the Democrats on the panels seem to behave a little more than the Republicans on the panels. And the moderators just don't seem equipped to deal with that.
So there are two things that you said that interest me. One is the aspect of the lies, which obviously they should be called out on, right? When we discuss things, to say an outright false thing should never be allowed, and they should be called out on that. Mm. The propaganda aspect, I'm a little bit more accepting of that, right? Because what is the line between your standard talking points, like, oh, Joe Biden did this, this, and that, and propaganda, right? If propaganda is so yeah, how do you distinguish between the two?
Well, I mean, I tend to fall back on sort of the Goebbels approach to the definition of propaganda, not approach. I don't advocate anything that Goebbels said. Basically, his definition is you start with a big lie and then the little lies people will buy. And that's what I mean by propaganda, not just giving your talking points passionately. That's fine. Right. It's giving your talking points based on lies. And the anchors just don't. Some of them do a fine job with that. Someone like Wolf Blitzer is pretty good at that. But some of them, they don't seem to know how to deal with these people that won't stop lying to them.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think George Stephanopoulos, he interviewed J.D. Vance. We'll put this in the show notes. But he basically cut him off air. He says, hey, can you denounce this? And then he didn't. And then he was asked again, and he ignored it. And then, George just cut him off. He said, all right, thank you for your time. You just moved on. So I think that is like one strategy, right? Where you can just say,
I think most of the anchors are, I saw part of that, and I appreciate that because it reminds me of, say, Ted Koppel. You're too old, you're too young to have watched much Ted Koppel, if any, on Nightline, but he was the best interviewer I ever saw because he was very down the middle, but he would not take your bullshit. If you were going to keep talking over him and keep lying and he would just, okay, we're going to be done with you. And that's exactly what I want to see from anchor. If somebody, let people come on, give them, but if they're going to be how they are and you can't control them, either cut them off or don't have them on. It does a service to the audience, I think, just to.
I agree.
Wait, and then just keep talking over you, and Democrats do that too. But the Trumpers that I've seen lately on CNN that I didn't used to see seem to be doing it a lot more than I've seen in the past.
Yeah, because they know that they can get away with it. I would also push back on the notion that the statement you said, something along the lines of, the Biden years are chaotic and the Trump years were, serene and fantastic, right? That's a matter of opinion, right? Because you could definitely say, hey, pre-COVID, things were pretty good under Trump. Inflation was down. There was chaos in the White House, but that didn't affect someone's day-to-day life. Whereas now, you have inflation, you have the war in Ukraine, you have the Israel-Gaza war. You could make the argument that that's not a lie, right?
But certainly as an anchor, you shouldn't let somebody say that that's the first time he'd said it, and he said it there, and she let it go and just moved on. That's the kind of thing where you need to challenge somebody and say, well, what evidence do you have of that? In my mind, if you're a good interviewer, you are going to say that. You are going to challenge somebody when they make these statements without evidence. And they're not doing a good enough job of holding them accountable for what they say.
I think the reality is, these segments are like 10 minutes, right? So you're constrained by time. If you're in like a 60 minutes format, you can push back all day. And I think Jonathan Swan did that when he interviewed Trump. I don't know if you saw that interview, but like
I
Trump
don't
was
think I did, but
so basically Trump was saying, hey, COVID deaths are going down.
oh yeah, okay.
And Jonathan Swan said, no, they're going up. Look at the charts. And then he basically called him out right there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if he's gotten an interview since. And I think that's kind of what it boils down to, right? Like if you're too harsh,
they won't talk to you.
You lose your access, right?
I'm talking more about the panels they have on CNN and bring all these people together, and these people want to come on. They want to spew the talking points, and they know that if they keep it up with a steady stream, that they'll overwhelm the host.
Yeah, and I think the more people you have on the panel, the worse, right?
Yes. You're talking over each other and back and forth and all that stuff.
So, like for instance, on Fox News, they had the five, right? Which you have one liberal. It's typically Jessica Tarlov, and then a bunch of other generally pro-Republican folks. And Jesse Waters, who's typically like one of the main people there, will say something outrageous, and then Jessica gets really upset and has to call him out on that. But after that discussion is done, I feel like I haven't learned anything, right? Because it's the format itself, right? Having five people talk on one topic and it's not even one topic, right? Because they just the conversation naturally evolves. But yeah, for just 10 minutes, and then you have your commercial break. I think
it's like
the underlying format itself lends itself to being taken advantage of like that, right?
Sure.
So maybe CNN should consider flat out changing the format, right?
Yeah, that's a thought. And so, I'm not trying to say, just for anyone wondering, am I saying everything should be pro-Democrat? And I'm not. Hopefully, our viewers and listeners notice that I like to challenge stuff, and I want data, I want hard facts, I want information. That's the kind of thing I'd like to see on TV. And I know it's kind of a pipe dream, right? But I don't say, well, CNN is showing too many Trumpers. Let me turn over to MSNBC. I tried to do that one night, and I lasted like 5 minutes, because everything they do, that's propaganda in the own way, not maybe the hardcore Goebbels kind, but the kind where the framing,
talking points, right? Framing and talking points
that they use to introduce issues and talk about the news that they're going to talk about is set up to reinforce Democratic hopes and talking points and positions. And I have no use for that at all. If I'm going to use news information or discussion of news as something I can learn from, I want to hear people push back and challenge each other. And that's what I think is missing a bit, which leads us to what do you do then? And my response is, well, people should read. And then the second thing they should do is they should read some more, right? And you could keep reading some more if you want to. And you don't just read one source. I try not to just read the New York Times. I like the New York Times. I find their news perfectly accessible and pretty down the middle. If they tell you something happened, it happened. Now we're going to distinguish between the editorial page and the news page. The news side, the hard news stuff, pretty reliable. Same thing can be said for the Wall Street Journal. Now, most people aren't going to want to subscribe to both because they're kind of expensive. But you're not going to read about something that happened in the Times and the Wall Street Journal is going to say, well, actually, you know what? The Times is wrong. That didn't really happen.
Yeah.
They're going to agree on what happens in the world. They can spin stuff considerably in their editorial page, but find a newspaper you like and read it online. I don't have a hard copy subscription anymore either. I get our local newspaper, I get the New York Times, and I read the Denver Post as well. And then some other things as stuff comes in. But if you do that, you can at least check what people are saying, right? If you're hearing what's on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, don't trust, especially the opinion people on the panels. Almost everything they say is something you'll want to take a look at and read about it and make sure that they have the right facts. And that, I think, is probably the best advice we could give people. If you're looking for advice on what sort of media strategy to use, because I know I've went through this myself. It's like, well, CNN is not as appealing to me anymore. I'll just fall back. And I do this anyway. I read the news every day. Probably read a little bit more now, watch a little less TV. It's probably good for me. Probably not good for their ratings, but that's what I would suggest. And don't even think about getting news on social media. If you find something on Twitter that's like, ooh, that's interesting, look it up. Make sure that they're lying to you, because there's a decent chance.
Yeah. So there are two things. One is, how should the MAGA point of view be represented, right? Can we distinguish, some of the legitimate beliefs that they have, right? For instance, if you believe that America should have a more isolationist stance, if you believe that, the rural identity is being destroyed in this country, I think that's a fine opinion to have. I think it's the implementation when you have folks like Stephen Miller in powerful positions in the administration, people who are agnostic as to whether something's constitutional. I think that's where it starts getting dicey. So where do you draw the line in terms of viewpoints? Because at the end of the day, there's 40% of this country, right? Or at least 40% of voters subscribe to these points of view, right? And we need to know about that.
That's a good point, that people do need to know what they're saying. But I think unless they can separate it from the constant lying and just complete, I won't say spin because everybody spins, but you got to be able to separate truth from reality, right? If you're on there and you're going to still talk about January 6th and you're going to talk about patriots and you're going to talk about the Justice Department, if you're going to sit there and lie, then I don't want to hear what you have to say. I don't think you're a serious person. I don't think you've thought out your policies for your other points of view. If you can be serious about your views, I'm happy to listen to you. Right? If you have to mix them in with all the lies and the BS that they usually give us, I have no time for that.
Right. And then the second thing that I want to point out is the media is going to give us what we want, right? It is my opinion that people don't want to be informed. They want to be entertained for the most part. And they want their views to be, they don't want their views challenged, right? They want them to be reinforced. So I don't know what the media can really do about that, right? Because there are plenty of sites that exist right now that cater to the world that we want to live in, right? Vox does explainer news. I think it's a really good way of doing things. Yes, it leans left, right? No doubt about that, and you have to be able to sense that. Axios does a really good job at making news succinct, and why it matters and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, people aren't going to these sites that exist. Instead, they would rather share a meme on Facebook. So
well, I mean, I get to pull out my favorite.
Dare I bring up Zeitgeist?
No, I'm going to bring up H.L. Mencken. Right? Nobody ever went broke underestimating the intelligence of the American public or lost political office thereby. Right? Unfortunately, we got the public who we have. Right? And companies are going to cater to the public, what the public wants. There are some, you can still go out. Again, I'm going to sound pretentious and condescending here when talking about public tastes, but you're right. The public taste is not for, hey, give me information, right? It's give me information that proves my point that I'm right. And a lot of news has become that. MSNBC is exactly that. Fox News is exactly that. I don't know what CNN's trying to do right now. It's just kind of chaos there. It's really weird.
Right.
But I still think you can go to the news pages of the major paper. You can go to the news stuff that comes out of the Times. You can go to the news stuff that comes out of the Wall Street Journal, right? And you can get information. Right? You're going to get entertainment on their editorial pages. The Times is left, the Journal is right. They always have a token lefty and a token righty, depending on the organization. But I think you can, if you're interested in it, you can get real news from things and from the major regional papers too, right? Dallas Morning News, LA Times, all those, the Chicago Tribune, right? You're going to get good news from these places. And interestingly enough, like local news tends to be pretty straightforward because
Right.
their audience is both sides for the most part. So they're one of the few places where they tend to be a little bit, if you want to know news about your locality or your state, local news is a pretty good place to find it.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. So one last thing I want to point out, though, is there's news and then there's analysis, right? Sure. I think when you whatever lens you analyze something with is going to have bias.
Definitely.
So I think instead of subscribing to a particular newspaper, though I do recommend that because you're going to get multiple lenses, but you should find authors that you trust, right? And then you can follow them on Substack. Sure. That is also an option.
One strategy I always recommend to students, and pull on my professor hat for a second, is find somebody on your side that you disagree with, right? There are plenty of progressives and liberals out there that you can think are foolish and silly. Find one and read what that person has to say. And then find a conservative that and the other way around, depending on if you're conservative, find a liberal that you like, a conservative you don't like. If you're liberal, find a liberal that you don't like and a conservative that you like. And compare the views and the analysis that come out of those sources, right? Those, I think if you can find someone from the other side who you can take seriously and really entertain what they're saying, it's going to help you make more sense of what's going on. It's like I mentioned this before to you, but my favorite columnist of all time was William Safire, a very conservative guy, which in the Nixon administration wrote for the Times forever and a day. He didn't agree with anybody. I just love that about him. And as you might imagine, I have a little bit of that in my own persona. I find it very easy to disagree. So if you find a Republican who disagrees with Republicans or a Democrat who disagrees with Democrats, they're probably worth listening to, and at least worth including in the people that you pay attention to.
All right. So, on my side of things, someone I really respect right now, who is a liberal, is Ezra Klein. He is a very thoughtful person. And at the end of the day, that's what I want, right? I just want someone who's thoughtful in their analysis. You're probably not going to like this person, but, Bill Kristol during the Obama years was very anti-Obama. But he's considered an ever-Trumper now. And he writes, thoughtful analysis for the Bulwark now. And obviously I'm a big fan of David French, who's conservative, but he now writes for the Times. There
are people out there to look for. And if you find, like I said, find somebody from the other end of the spectrum that you think is worth paying attention to, that'll be a really good source to consider. You get different takes that are, as you said, considered takes rather than just, here's our talking points.